We want to kind of foreground this idea of ecocidal capitalism in this evening's talk, and I want to kind of locate it. Let me see how this works. I'm hitting the arrows. Does anyone know? Oh, that one. Okay. Okay, so we are on a speaking tour, and we spoke at the University of Vienna recently in Germany. And one of the things we underlined in that conversation was that Marx was not the founder of modern ecology. But Marx, in his thinking, actually has a serious engagement with ecological relations, and particularly nature. And it goes back actually to his PhD, which was awarded by the University of Vienna on the 15th of April, 1841. And it actually has a materialist conception of nature in his comparison between Democritus and Epicurean philosophies of nature. And our recommendation to colleagues at the University of Vienna was to consider publishing this PhD for a wider audience, and maybe it could be done collaboratively, even with the University of Linz. So South Africa is a poster nation for a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius increase in planetary temperature. Of course, it's not alone. You can include in that club all the OECD countries, and Trump, for example, has placed the US at the top of the charts in terms of fossil fuel extraction today, so another carbon criminal state. We are the 14th highest carbon emitter in the world. Our per capita carbon intensity is higher than China, Brazil, and India. So we are, if you like, culpable of carbon criminality, and we are posing a challenge to all of us and to other life forms. And this perspective of a logic of destroying the conditions that sustain life for everything derives from a project called the Democratic Marxism Project. So I'm going to just veer off in that direction a little bit to say something about this project and sort of situate it. The Democratic Marxism Project emerges in the South African context, and it's very different from, for example, the Socialist Register, which has its origins in the 60s, and somebody called Ralph Miliband and others in the New Left played a very, very important role in navigating and pioneering the Socialist Register. But the Socialist Register is about conjunctural analysis. It's about trying to understand contending forces, contemporary dynamics in struggle, etc. Another very interesting project out there as a platform for Marxist thought and discourse is Monthly Review, and it's based in the US. It goes back to the work of Paul Baran and Sweezy, and it's really about what is called the monopoly capital school of Marxism. And it seeks to kind of situate contemporary developments in relation to that. And then, of course, in the Global South, the one project that we reference and think with is Subaltern Studies. And Subaltern Studies has produced various people's histories of struggles from below, and it has reread Gramsci in context, in the Indian subcontinental context, and has also, of course, moved off in a post-structural, post-modern direction. So we are different from these projects, and the Democratic Marxism Project is grounded in the lived reality, in the history of struggle, in a tradition of Marxism emanating from the South African reality. We have a tradition of Marxism that's over 100 years old. There's a very interesting feminist called Olive Schreiner. Has anybody heard of Olive Schreiner? Oh, she wrote a classic in South African literature called The Story of an African Farm. I recommend it. But she also wrote a beautiful book called Labor and Feminism. And she was a very powerful socialist at the turn or the beginning of the 20th century. And she put out a critique of monopoly capitalism and exploitation. She was a strong anti-war activist, and she was an anti-imperialist. And at that time, she had a strident critique of somebody called Cecil John Rhodes. Have you heard of Cecil John Rhodes? Yes, the great imperialist, exactly. So Olive was really a pioneer, if you like. There were other traditions of Marxism that struck root in the South African context, a Bolshevized Marxism-Leninism shaped by the Russian Revolution. Trotskyism and its minimum program also found roots in South Africa. But all of these traditions of Marxism, in the end, were forced to indigenize and to understand how capitalism in South Africa was reproducing racial oppression, class oppression, and adding to that roster, gender oppression much later. All of this was framed in a discourse around what is called the national question. We also had an independent Marxist tradition in South Africa, mainly in academia, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and we received our Marxism in this regard. We had the Althusserian moment in South Africa, the Neo-Polancian moment, the E.P. Thompson moment, and we had a very vibrant tradition of social history, the history workshop, which is still going strong in South Africa. We also had an organic Marxism developing in the ranks of the working class. South Africa is the most industrialized country on the African continent, and it threw up a very powerful labor movement that has shaped its politics throughout the greater part of the 20th century. And within this labor movement, there's been a dynamic impulse of thinking for itself about the lived realities of capitalism. And there is a Marxism there, grounded in a politics of worker control, worker autonomy, and so on. At the same time, strutting around South Africa has been the death of Marxism thesis, haunting our institutions, etc. And this is largely because of the crisis of the National Liberation Project in South Africa, the decline of the hegemony of national liberation politics, but also, of course, certain cultural and philosophical turns, the march of identity politics in our universities, and so on. But despite that, there's a lot of space in South Africa, and the Democratic Marxism Project claims some of that space. So it's a project of renewal. It's about reconnecting with the impulse of independent Marxist thinking and the organic Marxism of the working class. It's also about a dialogue between the global North and South. And our leading neo-Marxist who passed on recently in the African context, Amir Amin, he gave us an endorsement for one of our volumes. And of course, Amin's thesis consistently was, the weakest link is always going to be in the global South, and that's where change is going to come from. And so he vaunted and celebrated this intellectual project. The world today, of course, is going through various crises. And in a funny way, the global North is mirroring what we're going through in the global South, and vice versa. The march and the rise of a neo-fascism is not particular to the global North. We're also seeing it in the peripheries of capitalism as well, for instance. But the old 20th century left imagination is in crisis. Soviet socialism and all its copies, social democracy, revolutionary nationalism and all its articulations are all in crisis. And we are living through a period of a new cycle of global resistance. And in that context, we have to be learning about the ferment, the outpouring, the new praxis, the new ideas that are defining what it means to be left today. And so this project tries to locate itself in the midst of all of that ferment. The Democratic Marxism series is also a platform for a creative geometry of ideas. Okay, so I agree with my comrade Samir up to a point, but I do think we also need to have a dialogue with comrades in the global North. So very briefly, these are the premises of the Democratic Marxism project. It recognizes that in Marx, thinking in the 19th century, and at a very abstract level in his more mature work on capitalism, that we are dealing with an unfinished body of work, and that we need to situate Marx, Marxist categories, Marxist theorizing in the context of the new dynamics of global capitalism today. We need to ask whether capitalism is in a new stage of its development. Is it moving beyond monopoly capitalism? Is it about a transnational, financialized techno-capitalism today? And what is it unleashing and so on? And what do the categories in the historical Marxist tradition can assist us with in terms of explaining and understanding these dynamics? Then, of course, we are also trying to do conjunctural analysis. We are trying to understand what are the contending class and popular forces shaping the world today, shaping our continental political economy, our domestic South African political economy as well. The third important premise for this project is to think with other anti-capitalisms. That is anti-capitalisms that range from the new anarchisms to radical Democrats, to anti-corporate left, to the ecological, deep green left, and so on and so on. Marxism does not have a monopoly of what it means to be anti-capitalist today. So in a sense, this series is about inviting a conversation even with those that stand against the grain of Marxism, so that we are not, if you like, engaged in an echo chamber, listening to ourselves and validating our own narrow truths. The other important premise for this project is to connect with the living impulse of struggle today. So it's not about, if you like, an academic Marxism located in the university. This project in its intellectual production involves activists, movement leaders, activist scholars, and even in the way we've developed the series, we bring activists together to debate with the perspectives that are emerging in this space. Even after the books are produced, we go into activist spaces to debate and deliberate. So the knowledge journeys, if you like. This was the first volume very quickly, and it's really about sketching a research agenda for the democratic Marxism project. And we place Marxism in dialogue with the likes of the other Karl Polanyi. We place Marxism in dialogue with Foucault and feminism and ecology and, of course, South African Marxism. The second volume is really about complexifying the nature of crisis in the world today. Singular, monocausal explanations, financialized overaccumulation, are important, and they help us understand to a large extent what's going on in the world today, but it's not adequate. And so there's a challenge in this volume about rethinking and re-theorizing crisis. We are going through a historically unprecedented crisis, and it's a convergence of various systemic dynamics. It's a civilizational crisis, and we need to think this afresh. The third volume, which was mentioned by Brigitte, is on the climate crisis, and here again we bring together the leading climate justice activists in the world, from Pablo Solon, the negotiator for the only climate justice state that was present in our interstate system, Pablo Solon, Nimo Basi from the Niger Delta, who's been fighting the Shell Corporation, is in this volume. We have people like Alberto Acosta from Ecuador, who've been centrally involved in constitutionalizing a new green constitutionalism in Ecuador and so on. But the central idea is the just transition. What are the modalities of this just transition so we sustain life? And the notion of ecocidal capitalism also, if you like, makes its way out of this conversation. The next volume is coming out next year, and it's called Racism After Apartheid. It will be out in March, and really, this volume is about challenging, on the one hand, a Marxism that is blind to race, a class-only Marxism, a Marxism that fails to appreciate that even in European society today, if you're going to understand what's going on with migration and so on, you can't just explain it with a class lens. You have to understand racism as a relation of oppression and bring that into perspective. On the other hand, you also have very reductionist thinking around race. And so this volume also poses a challenge to that kind of thinking, but also a kind of dismissal of Marxism as Eurocentric thought. This volume takes that argument head on, epistemologically and so on. So to just come back to ecocide and Marxist ecology, because this is a theme that emerges from these conversations we've been having with activists and movements and so on in this series. And essentially, the points we want to make very quickly in summary of amazing work that's already been done by Marxists is that Marx was an original systems thinker. He connected human social relations with nature. Marx understood that the labor process mediated this relationship with nature, and it's there in his work, in his early philosophical work. It's also there in his historical materialism. Marx recognized capitalist social relations engendered alienation from nature. There was also, if you like, an understanding that there was this rift that capitalism's antagonism developed. And then, of course, Marx understood that value creation is grounded both in nature and in labor. But in the end, Marx didn't have a blueprint for a socialism, and particularly a productivist socialism, which is what was the hegemonic socialisms in the 20th century. But this work has been covered by other Marxists, Foster, Burkett, Saito, and they really, if you like, read Marx with an ecological sensitivity, with an appreciation of where nature fits into Marx's philosophical understanding, his historical materialism, his value form of analysis, and even a kind of socialism that could emerge from this understanding of Marx. So work has been done on Marx's ecology, and I think we just wanted to affirm this today. But the concept of ecocide and the logic of capitalist ecocide really works within this framework. If you like, it recognizes that there's a deepening antagonism with nature, there's alienation from nature, there's occluding the value of nature, and there's the destructiveness of productivist accumulation. So ecocide, if you like, has a place within a Marxist analysis of contemporary carbon capitalism. But I want to move beyond this to also take us down a different path to see how ecocide as an analytical concept and a category and a way of thinking about capitalism today can help us engage with some of the more contemporary thinking out there. So I want to talk very quickly about the idea of the Anthropocene and Anthropocene theory. So this is the big idea coming from geologists. It's basically suggesting that there's a fundamental break with an 11,000-year Holocene period in which we had a relatively stable climate, and that we are leaving that behind. And the Anthropocene discourse is a scientific discourse. If you read the IPCC reports, the 5th cycle, including the 6th cycle now, it uses this language of the Anthropocene, anthropogenic forcings, human causality, all of this comes out. But this discourse is also shot through with a technocratic approach to how we think about the problem. And it can also be anthropocentric in the sense that it sees us as the apex species, we've conquered nature, and therefore the solutions just lie in our re-engineering of nature. So central to this thinking is that for 150 years, we've had carbon emissions through coal, through oil, through gas. 50 years ago, the golden spike, and increasing intensive use of carbon. But what it fails to appreciate, even in putting the science front and center, is that this is centrally involved in the ecocidal logic of capitalism. And so there's the Anthropocene narrative 1, which is generic human causality, and we are all culpable, and I'm not going to speak to that. But I want to speak very quickly through Anthropocene 2, which is capitalism's crises, imperial ecocide, capital as a geological force, eco-racism, eco-patriarchy, and mass resistance. So I'm going to kind of move in that direction around the second narrative of the Anthropocene. So if we were to think about our theory of crisis and ecocide very quickly and in a nutshell, basically, you know, the operating parameters of planet Earth have changed, right? So we all know that in the room, right? So we are now at a 1-degree increase in planetary temperature, right? That's the science, we all know it in the room. Our world has changed. We are living in a new world. All living generations today are living in a new world. Generations that are coming are going to be living in a very different world because it's probably going to be warmer. So that operating parameter has also inaugurated some fundamental shifts in our climate globally, including registering extreme weather shocks, etc. But the nature of crisis that comes with this is a crisis that is much more complex than we've understood it. It interlocks with food systems, with water systems, with energy systems, transport, health systems, and so on and so on. So the ecocidal logic of capitalism is undermining the planetary conditions that sustain life. It's a crisis of capitalist civilization. And it is a materialist, a historic, and a contextual way to understand this. It's a new frontier, if you like, of theorizing. In addition, if we were to think about the Anthropocene as imperial ecocide, what we'll recognize is that the destruction of human and non-human life has been there even in the prototypical moments of capitalism's emergence, even at the time of mercantile capitalism, the Columbian encounter, and it has been there, wiping out people, genocidal violence, the extinction of species, and so on. And it's been premised on this duality of nature's out there, and we are humans, and we are more superior, and we can conquer it, and so on. And the hegemonic cycles we've seen over the past 500 years have also been premised on imperial ecocide. So ultimately, today, we have this new US-led imperialism. It's going through, some would argue, its second cycle. It's a high-tech, industrialized warfare, financialized, carbon-driven imperialism. It is deeply racist. So as Trump cranks up fracking in the US, the shocks that hit us in the global south, well, he doesn't care, right? South Africa is going through its worst drought right now. In 2014, Ethiopia and Kenya had massive shocks as well. The southwestern state of Kerala, India, had the worst drought in its history. These are poor countries. How are they going to rebuild themselves? Okay? Very serious financial constraints and so on. But there's also, if you like, a failure to recognize that planetary life is imperiled as we continue down this carbon capitalist path. And that is why it is imperial ecocide. It is destroying all of us. But in the explanatory approach of the Anthropocene 1, we are all to blame for what's going on. But actually, the real geological force linked to imperial ecocide is capital. And capital really is the one that's driving the madness, the global suicide, if you like. And it's based on either a carbon capitalist project or a climate capitalist project. We'll do a bit of green, we'll do a bit of geoengineering, we'll do a bit of nuclear, we'll do a bit of carbon trading and so on. But these are all false solutions. And they share certain things in common. And the one thing that stands out in all of this is, if you like, well, a logic that's going to destroy all of us. I mean, there's a whole lot of other pathologies with this thing, but I don't have time. The point, though, is the climate justice movement. And how do we build a powerful movement that can rise to these challenges, that can, if you like, confront extractivism, confronts false solutions, confront decarbonization and advanced alternatives. And in this regard, democratic eco-socialism is very important. And it has found its place. It has a long itinerary. It relates to what I started with, the ecological in Marx, but that's just one current. It relates to the greening of Marxism. It relates to addressing ecological problems in a much more rigorous political economy way, and it's being articulated by systemic movements. Movements that are calling for system change and not climate change are also expressing, if you like, a commitment to a fundamental break with ecocidal capitalism. And of course, central to all of this is building red-green alliances. And in this context, we really have to think about how do we make trade unionists green, and how do we make environmentalists red? That is a fundamental challenge for all of us. A crucial social force in our society is the labor movement. And we got to bring and ensure the labor movement is central to this deep just transition, which is an idea that also comes from, if you like, trade unions. I'm going to conclude now because of time, and to just say that the South African case, which Michelle is going to talk about, further kind of explicates some of these issues. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Vish. Let me just begin by echoing the thank you. I don't even want to try to name all the different institutions, but the University of Linz, the Hochschule, the University of Vienna, and the institutes within those, but especially to Brigitte, Roland, Fabian, who's actually held us by the hand for the last 2 days, and Katja as well. So, and Karin, I don't know where she is. She also gave us a wonderful time in Vienna. Ah, there you are. So thank you. We've had a wonderful time. And it's true, we were invited 2 years ago. I'll send you the book to prove that I really was doing research in India. Okay, so Vish set kind of the global context, and he also set the context of our democratic Marxism series. And then we decided, writing a lecture together is always a complicated thing. So we just decided it was easier that I cover the South African side. It's always also married to a project that I'm currently working on about the link between democracy, energy, labor in the South African context. Okay, so I'm not sure if you know about, there's 2 amazing books that influenced my thinking originally around this, and that's Andreas Mal's book on the water wheel, democracy and carbon, as well as Timothy Mitchell's book called Carbon Democracy. And both of these books basically show that the relations around energy and democracy are socially determined, and they change over time. So Mull shows us how the water wheel, the original form of energy, was actually a very good form of energy, but it had the distinct negative consequence that you had to bring labor to the water wheel. So in response to this, there was a development of coal, and coal was actually a much better form of energy, only in the fact that it brought the energy in the factories to the towns where workers already lived. So for many, for corporations, this had a big advantage, but it also had the distinct disadvantage for corporations, advantage for labor, that it also helped produce organized labor and deepen democracy in these areas. Then they talk about how the shift to oil from coal over the course of the 20th century was not because it was necessarily just a better energy source, but rather that it helped reduce the power of labor and strengthen the power of corporations and the states that promoted these. So the basic idea is that the link between energy and democracy is not accidental, but it was contingent and it was constructed over time. And there's also the point that we often talk about the undemocratic states of the oil-producing countries. And their point, and especially Timothy Mitchell's point, is that it's actually also limited democracy in the global north because it destroyed labor's capacity to organize. So keep that in the background, because that now helps shape the conversation we have about South Africa. Okay, so what does South Africa's history look like? Well, South Africa has many similarities with the rest of the world. It has a strong labor movement that's been linked to mining. Mine workers played a crucial role in the democratic claims making throughout the 20th century. I don't think I can overemphasize this point. The trade union movement in South Africa, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, had such a powerful democratizing influence in our society. It's been a very powerful labor movement, but it also played an incredibly important democratizing role in the society. So much of what is good in the post-apartheid period is directly linked to the power of labor. And there was a unique form of labor in South Africa, and that was the community union linkages that we had. And this is where, during the anti-apartheid movement, the labor movement, the trade unions, organized in communities because they lived in these communities. So the link between, there was never a labor aristocracy or just a economism of the labor movement. It was very much linked to the political project, but also to communities. So labor has played a hugely important democratizing force for much of the 20th century. But the differences between South Africa's history of energy and democracy are very stark as well. First of all, we found coal in 1878, and almost at the exact same time that we found diamonds and then gold as well. So the South African economy developed in this very mutually constituting way between energy and the minerals. And so much so that our economy is now what we call is based on a minerals energy complex. Just a side note, which is actually kind of a tragic note in history, 1878 is also when solar was discovered, and there was a solar exhibition in Paris at this innovation fair, and it was being heralded as the kind of future energy. And then coal prices just dropped and became widely distributed, and partly because of the enormous reserves of coal. South Africa has at least, even today, at least 100 years, some people say up to 200 years, of coal left. And mostly in relation to the history, the coal is generated and distributed by a parastatal, a state-owned enterprise that has monopoly power together with some mining companies, which I'll talk about in a moment. Okay, so the development of coal, first it shored up local markets, and it was crucial for the expansion of our minerals and energy complex. But it also then quickly went to international markets. This required two-stage beneficiation. It just required much more mechanization, and it required infrastructure, transport, rail, and port infrastructure to be built. So we've had this kind of growing infrastructure development over the 20th century. And in 2011, South Africa produced 255 million tons of coal concentrated in 5 corporations. These 5 corporations mined 85% of our coal, and you can see all of them are transnational corporations. So there was this real, with strong partners in South Africa, but there was this real strong link between the parastatal, or state-owned enterprise, and corporates controlling the mining sector. So coal's role in the economy and energy production was, as I said, enormous, but it's been growing over time. In 2013, it was the most important mineral in the economy, and coal's value added rose, as well as its contribution to foreign direct investment. So, it also became now still between 85 and 90% of our electricity is coal generated, which is, I'll talk about in a moment, but it's quite shocking when you think about our renewable potential. So all of this, though, the one part that is still similar to the rest of the world is that corporations and the state have constantly tried to figure out how to weaken labor's power. And so most of the ways that they've done it in South Africa is not shifting away from coal because we've had so much coal, but through mechanization and moving the refineries near the mine so you don't have transport and you can't have labor sabotage along long-distance rails. So these have been their two main ways, so they have been trying to reduce the power of labor. But labor in coal has still had a significant power that it still has today. Coal is the third largest employer in mining, directly linked to the coal mines of 91,000 workers, but with downstream employment, and this includes the state parastatal, there's 60,000 workers, so a total of about 150,000 workers work in the coal industry. But employment has not matched the growth of production. There's been an enormous rise consistently over the 20th century of the production and amount of coal produced, but labor has been consistently retrenched. So the kind of typical signs, they go in opposite directions. But of the labor movement, of these 150,000 workers, 30% are still unionized. And so the largest and most powerful unions linked to mining are our largest and most powerful unions in the country. The National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, that's the manufacturing union, and the South African Transport Workers Union, SATAWU. That's the Transport Workers Union. The attempts by the state have been to curtail the power of these different unions in various ways, but it's mostly been through mechanization and consistent retrenchments in all the areas. Okay, so in South Africa, though, the energy sector does not promote democracy in a kind of concerted way. It has what it's tried to do is concentrate the power. The concentration of power in the state and in these corporations have actually congealed to a very powerful force that has actually been able to undermine many of the labor demands made by the unions. So apartheid, but it's shifted over time. So during apartheid, the state controlled the labor movement through a racialized labor regime, and it was completely codified in the state's laws. But in the post-apartheid, this was obviously no longer possible, and they shifted to a neoliberal regime and an elite-led democracy. And so what's happened instead is, instead of a racialized system, you've had a growing precarious labor movement, labor brokers, and various forms of ways in which the labor movement has been weakened in this sector. And of course, there's also the devastating environmental impact of coal. Coal continues to, in Johannesburg, the area we live, there's something called acid mine drainage. We can't drink, you can't drink the groundwater in Johannesburg directly because there's so much pollution in our water from 100 and something years of gold mining in the area. But it's widespread. There's also been a recent perverse development that in some of our traditional areas, the traditional leaders have started to rent or sell land to mining companies, and at the expense of the communities, the communal land that the communities have owned, and then have polluted actually some of these really pristine areas. And I'll mention a positive struggle against that in a moment. Okay, so alternatives for energy and democracy. So the abundance of possible renewable energy in South Africa, we apparently, I don't know how you actually determine these things, besides I guess just count the number of hours. Apparently we're like third or fourth highest possible place for solar. Like 300, I have the number somewhere, but 300 and something days of sun across the country, with many parts getting 360 days of sun. So we really have incredible potential for solar. But we also have wind, hydro, biogas, tidal. We have 3 coasts. So we are a place that could do multiple forms of renewable energy. And solar especially lends itself to democratic organizing, but also it could be a form of decentralization and redistribution. Because you could put solar panels on people's homes, you could organize in communities, and since pretty much everywhere across the country gets enough sun to power their communities with sun, you could have very positive developments around renewable energies. But the forces against renewable are very strong, as I mentioned before. So we have powerful interests that are vested in the coal production. But it's not exactly as you think. So it's the corporations, obviously, especially these 5 huge corporations. But there's also, and then the state parastatal, Eskom, but NUM and NUMSA have also had a very complicated relationship to the coal sector. So on the one hand, they just try to protect workers. And they're in a defensive position always because workers are getting retrenched in this sector. So they often will just align with saving Eskom and the coal manufacturing, the coal mining companies, purely to protect workers, to protect jobs, but yet they're still losing jobs. But they come out then against renewables because of that. But it's complicated because there's another side which I'll talk about in a moment. And the state itself is incredibly contradictory. The state planning reproduces in its planning documents, it has a number of planning documents, the National Development Plan and the New Growth Plan. Both of these reproduce the minerals energy complex. They have a little bit of space for solar, but most of it is about fossil fuel production, especially coal. So the state only plans to reduce energy reliance to 65% by 2030. And Vish mentioned the IPCC report and the 1%. I mean, this misses the targets by far. And it is not envisioning a strong place for renewable energy, not because it's not possible, but rather because of the vested interest. This is what we mean about ecocidal capitalism. It doesn't matter where it's heading, it's just happy to be making profits while it's heading there. But our state is also incredibly contradictory. So we have an integrated resource plan, which is another planning tool, and that envisions a much different energy mix. It envisions 42% of energy by 2025 to come from solar. But then at the same time, I mean, these documents all come out within a year of each other, and one says this thing and the other says this thing, so it's really a battle between which departments are the most powerful within the state. Because at the same time as the Integrated Resource Plan comes out, the Energy Department commits to a much lower and modest amount of renewables. But probably one of the biggest challenges we face is that the way in which they're envisioning renewable energy is through the private sector. So they're reproducing a market-led form of energy. And just to give an example, in 2014, 85.8% of all foreign direct investment was linked to renewable energies. So there's a massive boom in the renewable energy sector, but it's done through a state incentive program that really prioritizes corporations and large players and not small scale or community-led. Okay, but at the same time, we do have some important counter movements trying to build what we call a democratic eco-socialism and deep just transitions. People in Germany ask us why we use the concept of deep, because I guess it's more common to just say just transition. We do that because our state appropriated the concept of just transition, and so we're trying to distinguish because they're not really talking about a just transition, they're just talking, kind of appropriating the language. So the labor movement comes out of the labor movement, and the labor movement and the activists and everyone have said, no, we mean a deep just transition. But what's being envisioned here are community-controlled and owned energy systems. A lot of this is stuff you might know of, but this is also happening in the South African context. And I think one of the most exciting projects that we have, at least being thought about, is by NUMSA. So on the one hand, NUMSA has tried to defend jobs, which is understandable, but at the other hand, it has come up with 2 extraordinary documents in 2012 called based on socially owned renewable energy. And what it was doing is it went through a deep process through its shop stewards and in these energy groups where it actually started thinking about, we're in a dirty industry, we're in a dirty energy, fossil fuel-based capitalism in South Africa. How can we be at the cutting edge, at the forefront of a change to this? And what NUMSA did then, through these 3 or 4 years of thinking and meeting people, inviting experts in, they created these 2 documents that kind of map out how they could have a socially owned renewable energy system. And that was the idea of retraining workers in renewable energy sectors, but also to have worker-owned and community-owned energy systems. So it was not just about the point of production and the ways in which what the workers were doing, but also the ownership model. So theirs was a much more holistic alternative vision for the energy sector. There's also a really interesting 1 million climate jobs campaign, and these people have done some really interesting mapping where they show that if there was a real deep transition and a commitment, we've been very impressed with the public transport system in Germany and Austria, even though I know you guys all complain about it. It's pretty impressive. So be happy that you have what you have. These are the kind of things we're thinking about and trying to push the state to have, are things like shifting from, our car industry is so big in South Africa that all state, at a certain level and higher, and even in the union leadership, they all get car subsidies. And we envision things like, what if they got public transport subsidies and actually had to ride public transport? Since none of them do, and they have car subsidies, and the subsidies renew every 3 or 4 years, so people are incentivized to keep buying new cars because they lose that subsidy if they don't. It's a perverse form, and this is for state people who work in the public sector. So the people who have done the 1 million climate jobs campaign have envisioned these and mapped out, if you switched people from building cars to trains to buses to all these public sector things, then we actually could create 1 million jobs if we had the commitment to creating the jobs as well. We also have a lot of activism around the food sovereignty and food systems. We're not talking about it today, but our food system, we have, South Africa produces enough food to feed the country, but yet over 50% of our population goes to bed uncertain, are food insecure. So 24% of those go to bed hungry, and another 26% go to bed not sure where their next meal is going to come from. And that's in a country that produces enough food. But in the post-apartheid period, we increasingly export our food, and we have been, in this neoliberal kind of adoption of policies, they've concentrated the power and control of our food system. In addition to not feeding our people, it has incredible ecological impacts because our food now travels many miles. I mean, you guys probably eat some of our food in South Africa. It's okay if you drink our rooibos tea. You can't grow that anywhere else. But most other things you can grow elsewhere. We also have a campaign, Life After Coal campaign. A lot of these campaigns kind of come out from the communities themselves. And this is one I want to mention, Kolobeni's Right to Say No Victory. This is actually a really incredible campaign. And just 2 days before Vish and I left the country, they won this incredibly important victory in the legal system. Kolobeni is a pristine area on our east coast, in what's called the Wild Coast. If you ever do go to South Africa and you like to hike, it's a 7-day hike where you hike from village to village. It's really beautiful. It's completely pristine. And about 10, maybe 15 years ago, the state gave a titanium mine license to mine the coast there. And the communities that have lived there, it's communal land, have been struggling against this development. The struggle has been intense. People's lives have been ruined. People have been assassinated. One of the leaders was assassinated just a year ago. The mining company has tried to divide the community. So it's been a really heroic and intense struggle, and it's captured the imagination of the nation. They decided to have this campaign, and they took the company and the state to court, and they basically said, we, the community, have the right to say no. We can say no, we don't want a mine to come to our community. And because we have a complicated land tenure system, this is communal land, and so the rights are slightly different on communal land. And just a week ago, 2 days before we left South Africa, the High Court ruled in the community's favor and basically said, yes, you do have the right to say no, and that a corporation can't come in unless the community approves it. So that's a huge victory for us. It's also setting the possibility for many more struggles. I mentioned, because we have these communal land tenure, traditional leaders are supposed to be custodians of the land, but in a few places, especially like KwaZulu-Natal and in Mpumalanga, the traditional leaders have actually become they've turned the land into what they think is their own land and sell or rent it to mining companies, and communities are being displaced. They're even acting as labor brokers in some cases where they're basically proletarianizing these people, forcing them to work in the mines. So this judgment actually means that other communities can now also take the companies and the state to court and likely win. And if it goes to the constitutional court, it'll even be better because they'll likely rule in this favor as well. So it's a big victory. We also have things like the solidarity economy. We have a lot of cooperatives and local level community production. And a lot of these have very strong energy local flavors to them. And so they are thinking about energy differently and trying to resist. I mean, one of the other things is energy prices in the post-apartheid period have gone up significantly. The state shifted to a cost recovery model, so people actually feel the prices much more seriously and can't afford it with the inequalities that we have in South Africa. So there's been a lot of initiatives around these various ways in which communities can resist through the solidarity economy as well. So Vish can, in the questions, he can tell you more about the Climate Justice Charter, but they basically have put a call to Parliament to convene a special parliamentary sitting to discuss the 1.5 IPCC report. And they put a call to the president to basically demand this. So we're trying to get pressure from above as well. And then we've had the worst drought in our history over the last couple of years. And so there's raised the issue. We're a water-stressed society, a water-stressed country, and so issues around water commoning have also become a really important arena of struggle. So all of these are ways in which we're trying to envision a just transition, and the role of communities, labor, academics, activists have all been crucial in all of these. Okay, thank you. That's it.